Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky, so now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax. A gear-up landing followed by a dual engine failure. Two of the most rare emergencies in the airline world combined in one flight. Aircraft today are built specifically to warn pilots and to stop things like this from happening, so how come it did anyway? The answer to this will be told in one of the most shocking accidents in modern history. Stay tuned. What is the actual core of aviation safety? If we have to strip down all of the rules, regulations, procedures, checks and everything else that makes aviation so safe, then what are we actually left with? Well, I think that at the bottom of everything, sitting as the unshakable foundation of aviation safety, is individual responsibility and professionalism. And it is with that in mind that I want to start this story, which has shocked me deeply and I think you will be as well. On the 22nd of May 2020, a Pakistan International Airlines crew was getting ready for a reasonably short domestic flight from Lahore in Pakistan over to Karachi. This would have been a very standard flight if it wasn't for the fact that it happened in May of 2020, meaning that the whole world was in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic. This meant that there were strict lockdowns in place in Pakistan, and this flight was one of the only flights that was still being operated. On top of that, it was also taking place during the holy month of Ramadan, meaning that most of the crew members were fasting. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this Muslim custom, it includes not eating or drinking between dawn and sunset, and this flight was scheduled at around 1300 local time, which would have been around standard lunchtime. We have very little information about how the two pilots spent their day before this flight, but they had both flown significantly less than normal during the preceding 30 days. The captain had flown 10.5 hours during the 72 hours before this flight, meaning that at least he shouldn't have been rusty, but the first officer had not flown anything for an unknown amount of time. In any case, it was with this background that the two pilots met up in the crew room in Lahore to start planning for the flight. The weather was looking quite okay, with only some thunderstorms expected in Lahore much later in the afternoon, and at their destination, Karachi, the visibility was okay, with light to occasionally gusty winds from a southwesterly direction and no clouds detected. A really nice day for flying, in other words. The pilots continued by checking through the NOTAMs as well as their flight plans, but nothing looked out of the ordinary. They then continued over to brief their 6 cabin crew members who they were going to work with, and then they all walked together out towards the aircraft. So, who were these two pilots that were going to fly together then? Well, the captain had just turned 58 and had been working with Pakistan International Airlines for over 24 years. He had a valid medical and license at the time and over 17,250 hours of total experience. As part of those, just under 4,800 hours had been flown on the Airbus A320, on which they were now going to be operating. He had also recently been appointed as a standards inspector on the Airbus A320 fleet, meaning that he was seen as someone that was suitable to make sure that other pilots were following the standards expected when operating on this aircraft. And that's worth keeping in mind. But one really interesting tidbit for this story actually has to do with how the captain had managed to join the airline in the first place. Because when he applied back in 1996, he had been required to go through a psychological evaluation, like all of us pilots have to do. He ended up failing that assessment with, let's say, a far from flattering evaluation from the airline psychologists. They said that he was of bossy nature, firm, dominant and overbearing. He had below average intelligence and he tends to have little regard for the authority. He also had low mechanical comprehension with low comprehension of spatial relations, and his level of stress tolerance was also quite inadequate. Now that evaluation would have flattened almost anyone and also likely pushed them towards another choice of career, but not this guy. He instead asked for a second opinion from 5 other psychiatrists, 3 of them from the UK, who all gave him a green light to continue as a cadet. The problem for him though was that the Pakistan International Airlines had stopped allowing second opinions at that point. So what did he do? Well, he complained to the federal ombudsman, since the application that he had been filed before this change had taken place. The ombudsman actually sided with him, and he was therefore allowed to start his training, but I want you to keep that initial assessment in mind when you hear the rest of this story. The first officer was 33 years old and had substantially less experience than the captain. He had joined the airline about 10 years before, and during those 10 years he had only flown just under 2,300 hours, the majority of which about 1,500 hours or so on the Airbus A320. We don't know much about the first officer, but we do know that he had received some negative feedbacks during his initial training, which had held him back from being upgraded from second officer to first officer. But after 2015, his training history was pretty clean. Having said that though, given his limited experience and the fact that he was now going to be flying with a much more senior standard pilot, we can assume that the power gradient in the cockpit was probably quite steep. In any case, as the whole crew were now walking out towards the aircraft, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for this flight. This meant that the captain was going to be in charge of doing the walk-around, but before he started doing that, he went inside the cockpit to look through the technical logbook. The aircraft that they were going to fly was a 16-year-old Airbus A320-200, equipped with 2 CFM56 high-bypass turbofan engines, and those engines will play a very important role in this story. Before this flight, the aircraft had only been flying very infrequently due to the ongoing pandemic, but it had been maintained to the standards of the manufacturer and was in a generally good condition. So when the cabin crew had finished their security checks and boarded the 91 passengers that they were expecting, they closed up the doors and the pilots asked for push and start, everything according to normal procedures. At time 13:05 and 30 seconds, Pakistan International Airlines flight A303 started accelerating down the runway and soon took off normally, climbing up towards their destination. During the climb, one of the cabin crew called up the pilots and asked if they were interested in a light snack, but they both politely declined. Remember, they were still fasting. Now they soon reached their planned cruising altitude, flight level 340 or 34,000 feet, where they were scheduled to stay for their about 45-minute long cruise segment. And from the voice transcripts, it looks like the pilots were getting along reasonably well, discussing the pandemic and how it was affecting their lives, pretty much exactly like we all were doing back then. But it was when they were getting closer to the top of the descent that the first clues of what was ultimately going to cause this accident started to appear. At time 13:24 and 24 seconds, the flight was handed over to the Karachi area controller, who welcomed them onto the frequency and then cleared them for the Navabasha 2 Alpha arrival into Karachi. He also told them that they could expect the ILS approach for runway 25 left after that. Now, since the first officer was pilot flying, it was his duty to prepare the aircraft for the coming approach and also to complete the approach briefing. But as the top of the descent started getting closer, there was no signs of any approach preparations being done. Instead, the pilots just kept chatting away about some other non-operational stuff. Now, just for context here, in my airline, we typically start preparing for the approach about 100 nautical miles before we are expected to start descending. And we do that because there are actually quite a lot of things that needs to be done. The pilot flying would normally then hand over the controls to the pilot monitoring, meaning that the PM would be in charge of both the radio and the controls during this period, which would allow the pilot flying to concentrate on preparing all of the radios, courses, flight management computer, and the minimas. Once that had been done, the pilot flying would then give a comprehensive briefing to the pilot monitoring, pointing out any potential threats during the descent and how to deal with them. After that, the arrival procedure should be discussed, what type of approach they were planning on flying and how to properly fly that approach, including the missed approach procedure, followed by the landing distance calculations and the expected taxi routings. Of course, this type of briefing can be shortened down slightly if the pilots are very familiar with the airport or if it's the second time that they're arriving to that same airport that day, but it can never be completely removed. Having a shared picture of what is about to happen is super important, as noticing any deviations will then be much easier. Accurate preparations and briefings are actually some of the cornerstones in a well-functioning crew resource management. But in this case, the pilots instead just kept chatting away about non-operational stuff without seemingly any intention on completing that approach briefing. So you might be wondering then, if they didn't do this setup and brief, then how was the approach set up at all? Well, it is likely that one of them, probably the first officer, actually did this quietly on his own as their discussion continued. Now, the routing, including the expected standard arrival route and approach, would have been entered into the FMC already on the ground, and they had now gotten that confirmed by the controller as well. But without a proper briefing and a check of all of the included parameters, things can easily get missed, as we will soon see. So the approach briefing was never completed, and at time 14:15 local time, the first officer contacted the controller and requested initial descent. Now, frequent viewers might have noticed that it should have been the captain, not the first officer, that requested descent, since the captain was the pilot monitoring, but this would not be the first nor the last departure from standard operating procedures on this flight. Anyway, the Karachi controller answered the request and cleared them to descend initially to flight level 100 and, on pilot's discretion, proceed direct a point called Mackley, which the first officer also read back. And now came another flagrant disregard for correct procedures. You see, after an altitude clearance has been received, the pilot flying should set the new cleared altitude in the FCU and then call out set. The pilot monitoring should then verify that the value entered was the same as he or she heard, and if that was the case, then he or she should respond flight level 100 checked. By doing it this way, there is very little chance of someone making a mistake because of a misheard clearance. And if that still would happen, well, then this procedure would pick it up and a level bust could be avoided. This is a super important procedure, which we trainers hammer into our students on a daily basis, but it didn't happen here. Instead, the FCU was just updated to flight level 100, but there were no call-outs from any of the pilots. The second part of the clearance included what is known as a direct routing to a point called Mackley. And this point was situated on the extended center line from runway 25 left. Mackley was about 4 nautical miles away from the final approach point, Saben, where the aircraft was expected to be at 3,000 feet in order to be able to start descending down towards the runway. Now, this type of direct routings are very common, and especially during the pandemic, when there was almost no other traffic around, it would have been something that the pilots should have anticipated. Now, we pilots normally love these type of directs as they essentially are shortcuts, but they do also represent a potential challenge. Like I mentioned before, the aircraft flight management computer will calculate a top of descent based on the most economic idle descent profile. But that profile will assume that the aircraft have exactly as many track miles to achieve this descent as the pilots have programmed into the FMC. So if a shortcut like this is received, this can actually cut away quite a lot of these available track miles, meaning that the aircraft would end up being high on profile. Now, that's normally not really an issue. We can always use speed brakes or allow the aircraft to speed up to get rid of some of that extra energy, but interestingly enough, that didn't happen here. When the first officer started descending, he activated the aircraft's managed descent mode, which would just follow the pre-programmed profile. And even though they had now received a quite substantial shortcut, the aircraft started descending with about 1,000 feet per minute, meaning that it was still calculating with a few more miles of level flight before starting to descend along that calculated path. Now, this should have been a red flag for the pilots, as it indicated that the aircraft was still assuming that it had plenty of track miles still to run, when that was obviously not the case. There are basically 2 reasons why the flight management computer would react this way, and the first is that there is a waypoint with an at or above altitude restrictions somewhere along the route, which would then force the aircraft to stay up high. But that wasn't the case here. The other reason is that there is a procedural holding pattern programmed into the route at some point, which was the case here, but since the pilots had not done an approach briefing, they hadn't noticed that. And since that was now the case, there were still plenty of track miles inside of that holding that the FMC was calculating with. But of course, flying a holding is not normally what we pilots want to do. Now we want to try to intercept the ILS as soon as possible and take advantage of that shortcut that we just got to save on both time and fuel. And air traffic control will almost in all conditions also expect us to do just that. This, by the way, is why we pilots always try to keep manual check on how many track miles we have left to go and how far we are actually away from the landing runway. Because if we take our altitude in thousands of feet and then multiply that by 3, then we will get a rough estimate of how many miles that we will need. And if the available miles are less than that, well then we know that we need to start doing something about it. Not blindly trusting the FMC, but instead making manual backup calculations is the kind of airmanship that we are being paid to do. The aircraft continued descending down towards Karachi, and at time 14, 18 and 36 seconds, the aircraft intercepted its calculated path. This meant that the thrust was reduced back to idle and that the descent rate increased to about 2,400 feet per minute to follow the path. Air traffic control now came back in and cleared the flight to descend to 5,000 feet, which was read back by the crew, but again, there were no formal procedures followed when it came to actually setting this new altitude in the FCU. Now, I know that I keep pointing these details out, which might feel like very minor to a casual observer, but the thing is that they are actually really important. Seconds after the crew had received that latest descent clearance, a faint click could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder. This sound was similar to the sound of one of the push buttons on the audio control panel being pressed down. After that, air traffic control tried to call the aircraft 7 times, including 2 calls from a company aircraft, but without receiving any answer back from Flight A303. Finally, the aircraft did get back in contact, but only after the controller had called them up twice on the emergency frequency 121.5. Now, the most likely reason for this prolonged loss of communication event was that the crew had assumed a handover to the next frequency after that last altitude clearance, and that they had mistuned the next frequency before they just switched over. After they had made this ad hoc switch, the pilots just continued discussing their non-relevant issues, and this was likely the reason why they didn't notice that the frequency had gone completely quiet. It should be mentioned here that we almost never switch to a new frequency in the air unless we are clearly handed over by the previous air traffic controller. So the fact that they did this anyway is just another indication of severe complacency by these 2 pilots. And it was about to get much worse. The aircraft now continued its descent, and since no one had removed the holding pattern from Saban, the aircraft was still assuming that it would be executing that hold. This meant that the track miles calculated by the flight management computer was 23 nautical miles longer than the actual distance that they had available. Now, this would have been clearly shown in various ways, including an initial white left turn arrow indicated on the navigation display, and the fact that Saban appeared twice in the flight management computer with a white hold written in between. The expected initial FMC altitude at Saban was set to 8,900 feet. This was way too high for a straight-in approach. The absolute maximum altitude the aircraft should have had in order to be able to fly straight in would have been around 5,000 feet or so, but neither of these things were noticed by the crew. The aircraft was now handed over to the Karachi approach controller, and at time 14:25 and 54 seconds, this new controller cleared Flight A303 to descend to 3,000 feet on QNH 1004, and he also cleared them for approach. Again, the FCU altitude setting procedure was completely disregarded, as well as the confirmation of the correct QNH setting, but at least the first officer now armed the Autopilot approach mode, meaning that the aircraft would capture the localizer and glide slope beams whenever they became available. But even though they were now cleared for a straight-in approach, the aircraft just continued in its managed descent mode without any effort by the crew to increase the descent rate, meaning that they were now about 5,000 feet higher than they should be. So what could the pilots have actually done here then? Well, to be perfectly honest, this was still far from a dangerous situation. The fact that they weren't doing anything suggests that neither of the pilots had yet figured out that they were extremely hot and high, but when they did, they would have had a very easy solution. Just fly that holding pattern that the FMC was calculating with. This would have added about 5 minutes to the flight and would have felt quite unnecessary, but no one would have complained. It wouldn't have used that much extra fuel, and the landing time would have been exactly the same as they had already calculated with. Mistakes like this happens from time to time, and they're not a big deal, as long as you deal with them in a rational and safe manner. The aircraft soon passed Makli, which was the point that they had been cleared to, and after that came Saben with its computed holding. The aircraft was at 9,363 feet when it passed Makli, with a speed of about 250 knots and in clean configuration. Since they were now on the extended centerline and the approach mode had been armed, the localizer was now captured and started guiding the aircraft towards the runway. When the localizer captures, it disengages any previously selected horizontal mode, so this meant that the aircraft would now disregard the hold even if it was still left in the FMC. The approach controller, who had now already cleared them for the approach, looked down onto his radar screen and realized that the flight looked impossibly high, twice as high as they should be. He therefore called them up and asked, "Pakistan 8303, confirmed track miles comfortable for descent?" And the captain just responded, "Affirm." Now, this was a clear indication of what the controller thought of the matter, and for any pilot who hears those words, it should serve as an immediate prompt to start looking over their situation and try to figure out what was going wrong. The captain must have also done so here and realized to his horror that they had forgotten to remove the holding at Saben. He now called out, "What has happened? Stop, stop! Oh no! Take out the hold! Take out the hold! Take out the hold!" The first officer responded, "Hold taken out, should we report the issue?" indicating that he had followed the captain's orders, but that he also realized the severity of their altitude situation and that they might need more track miles. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is where the first decision is taken that will ultimately lead this aircraft into disaster. Because instead of just realizing the hopelessness of this situation and either ask to join the hold or ask for delaying vectors, the captain responded, "No, this could be due to the hold. Just tell Karachi approach established on localizer." The first officer agreed and also pulled out the altitude knob on the FCU, changing the autopilot descent mode from managed to open descent. In that mode, the aircraft would stop following the flight management computed path and instead descend with idle thrust according to the selected speed. Now, since the actual speed was slightly higher than the commanded, 245 knots, this meant that the aircraft initially actually slowed down its descent to achieve that requested speed, and at the same time, the first officer also activated the speed brake. The aircraft was at 14.8 nautical miles away from the runway at this point, with an altitude of 9,210 feet, meaning that they were close to the 6-degree glide slope, rather than the 3 degrees where they should have been. And that fact will soon have consequences. Now, there was actually a standard operating procedure available in the airline for approaching the glide slope from above. That instructed the pilots to use vertical speed with a maximum value of minus 1,500 feet per minute to try and intercept the glide, but that was clearly not going to be enough here. So with the speed brakes activated and the open descent mode, the aircraft now started descending significantly faster, and again without any correct FMA callouts or coordination from the crew. At the same time, the Karachi tower controller had also realized that the incoming aircraft was really high. He called up his colleague, the approach controller, and told him, "Sir, it's too high." And the approach controller, who had already seen this for quite a while, responded, "Yes, it's too high. I'm observing it and I will give it an orbit." A few seconds later, he then called up the aircraft and asked, "Pakistan 8303, report level passing?" The captain responded, "Out of 75 for 3,000. Now, the real altitude was actually 7,700 feet, meaning that the captain now wanted to make it look less than it actually was, clearly showing that he was aware of the issue. At this point, the aircraft overflew the initial approach point, Saben, at an altitude more than twice as high as published. There was no conceivable way for this approach to become stabilized at this point, but for some crazy reason, the pilots just kept pushing on. As they passed 10 nautical miles on final, the controller again prompted them about the distance, clearly to show that the altitude that they were at was completely inappropriate for that distance. But the captain, again, just responded, "No problem, sir," and continued. Now, so far, although the aircraft was insanely high, the crew hadn't yet started breaking any limitations, but that was soon about to change. Now, some of you might be asking here, wasn't this captain an Airbus A320 standard pilot? Where was his standards? And that's a very fair question. In the later investigation, the captain's operational flight data monitoring, OFDM file, was examined, and what was found in that was truly horrifying. First of all, Pakistan International Airlines had only managed to capture about 5% of their flights up to that point, which was really poor. But when the captain's file was scrutinized, multiple approaches relating to high speed, high path, high rate of descent, long flares, and even GPWS warnings were uncovered, meaning that this type of approaches that he was now flying was nothing new for him, rather the opposite. And that might give you a bit of an explanation to what was about to happen. At time 14:31 and 39 seconds, someone in the cockpit selected the landing gear down. We don't know who did that, since once again there was no verbal communication about it and no cross-check of speeds or anything else. But my guess is that this was done by the captain, as he was the one that was now pushing this approach forward, with the first officer just kind of passively trying to figure out what was going on. Since the aircraft was still descending in the open descent mode, the extra drag provided by the gear required the aircraft to pitch the nose down in order to continue with the selected speed, and this led to an increase in vertical speed to about 7,500 feet per minute. Only seconds after the gear had been selected down, the approach controller again tried to get the crew to realize their position by telling them, "Sir, orbit is available if you want," meaning that the crew could make a 360-degree turn to lose some altitude. But the captain just told the FO, "Say it's okay," and the first officer transmitted, "Negative, sir. We are comfortable we are going to make it." Again, if the first officer was pilot flying, he should not have been making the radio calls here, and the whole operation at this point was just very disorganized. When people are put in a highly stressful situation, especially one where things are happening seemingly outside of the person's control and in an accelerated way, it's not uncommon that the person becomes passive and just kind of follows the flow. This seemed to be really the case with the first officer, but it also likely that the captain, even though he was the one that was driving this whole crazy approach, now also started losing his situational awareness, since things were happening so fast and so far outside of normal operations. Anyway, now something else happened that will have a huge impact on this story. At time 14:32 and 18 seconds, the aircraft blasted through 4,817 feet with a vertical speed of around 4,200 feet per minute. Since the selected altitude in the FCU was 3,000 feet, the autopilot now calculated that it was time to start reducing the descent rate to capture the altitude, and it therefore engaged in altitude mode. This was not noticed nor called out by the crew, but at least the selected speed was now reduced to 230 knots. As this was happening, the captain could be heard saying, "He will be surprised that we have done this," likely referring to the controller, and this indicates that he was actually quite pleased with himself and where the aircraft now was, like if this was something to be proud of. But just as if he had heard that remark, the approach controller now came back in with a direct order. "Pakistan 8303, disregard, turn left heading 180. Because he had now likely had enough with this crazy maneuver, where he could see that the aircraft still was at a 6-degree glide slope, and he wanted to give the crew some extra track miles, whether they wanted it or not. But do you think that the captain listened? No. The aircraft just continued, and 8 seconds later, someone responded, "Sir, we are comfortable now, and we are out of 3,500 for 3,000 established on the ILS 25 left." But how was that possible? Just a few seconds earlier, the aircraft was leveling off at 3,000 feet and they were still way above the glide slope, so how come they were now fully established? Well, what had now happened was that since the aircraft was so high, it was now flying between the 3-degree and the 9-degree glide slope. In that region, the two radio lobes from the glide slope antenna interfered with each other, causing perturbations which the glide slope receiver in the aircraft interpreted as the glide slope captured. This was very unfortunate, because this meant that the level off at 3,000 feet, which would have otherwise saved them, now didn't happen, and instead the aircraft started pitching down like crazy to follow the 3 degrees glide slope thousands of feet below them. Now, before you start saying that the aircraft systems should have been able to figure this out, you have to remember that we have limitations, procedures and guidelines for a reason. It's almost impossible to build systems designed to handle gross misconduct from the pilots, and in this case, they should have never been in this position in the first place. As a response to the call from the crew, the approach controller now came back with a stern instruction. Negative, turn left heading 180 degrees, which is pretty hard to misinterpret. But the crew from Flight 8303 again just responded, "Sir, we are established on ILS 25 left," and then completely disregarded this direct instruction. 8 seconds later, as the aircraft passed 3,090 feet with 5.7 miles to go, the speed was 242 knots with 225 selected, but with a terrifying pitch of minus 12.6 degrees. At this point, flap config 1 was selected, likely to try and add some drag and slow the aircraft down, but since it was still diving, trying to align with the glide slope that was still well below them, this was completely fruitless. The maximum speed for flap extension was 230 knots, and since their actual speed was now 12 knots higher than that, an overspeed master warning coupled with the oral crickets and ECAM warnings now activated. Almost simultaneously, the pitch of the aircraft dipped below 13 degrees nose down, which is defined as an upset attitude and also the limit for what the Airbus Autopilot will allow. The Autopilot therefore disconnected, and this was accompanied by a separate Autopilot off warning. Now, none of these warnings were called out by any of the pilots, and instead the approach just continued manually. This must have been a terrifying experience for the first officer, because a normal nose attitude and approach is between -1 to +1 degree. So with the minus 13.7 degrees that they were now flying, this would have looked like nothing else that he'd ever seen. But now there were several warnings blaring in the cockpit, and this was only the beginning. But the sequence of these warnings will actually become super important for explaining one of the most common questions about this accident, but I'll get to that later. You see, when warnings appear in the cockpits, there is only so much different sounds and visual inputs that a person can process, especially under stress, and the aircraft manufacturers know this. Because of that, the warnings are prioritized, and only the most urgent audio warnings are played at any given time. Now, all of the warnings will be shown on the ECAM, and any associated lights will still be illuminated, but that rarely helps, since a situation requiring multiple warnings is by its very definition a stressful one. Remember that. Only 5 seconds after the Autopilot disconnected, the first ground proximity warnings were triggered by the aircraft's now incredible descent rate. They included an oral
sink rate,
followed by 2
pull up.
And to put this into perspective, any pull-up warning must be followed by an immediate execution of the terrain escape maneuver. There is absolutely no wiggle room here. The pilots must initiate an immediate pull-up, followed by several other actions designed to safeguard the aircraft's terrain separation. But what do you think happened in this case? Well, none of the pilots even called out the GPWS warnings, and the terrain escape maneuver was not initiated. But the first officer did actually start to input some nose-up commands on his side stick. That meant that the descent rate went from minus 7,400 to minus 2,000 feet per minute over the next 10 seconds. And also, and this is really important, the gear was selected up, as well as the speed brake retracted. Now, none of these actions were called out by whoever did them, but given the fact that it was the first officer who started pitching up, that would suggest that it was likely he who also retracted the gear and the speed brakes, most likely in an attempt to stop the approach. Now, retracting the gear yourself when you're a pilot flying is super strange, but then again, nothing was really working as it should in this cockpit. And things were still not over. At time 14:32 and 58 seconds, Karachi approach cleared Pakistan Airlines Flight 8303 to land on runway 25 left. So even though the gear was now up and the descent rate had moderated, the approach was still being continued, with the speed hovering at around 235 knots. And it was now that the next critical thing happened, because someone now selected the flaps out to first the config 2 and then the 3 position. Obviously, the speed was still higher than the maximum, even for config 1, so when config 2 and 3 were selected, these just activated more master overspeed and red ECAM warnings, and it's unlikely that the flaps actually started moving much, but the final report didn't really specify that. But what this all meant was that as the aircraft passed about 1,100 feet, it seems like a split had now developed in the cockpit. Because the first officer, who had likely retracted the gear and the speed brakes, now suggested that they should do an orbit, and actually also started executing that. But the captain, who had heard the landing clearance and also likely was the one who had selected the flaps into the landing configuration, responded, "No, leave it!" And he also now pressed the priority button on his side stick to take over the controls, but of course without calling out that he was actually doing so. So what was now happening was a cockpit with two pilots who were not sharing the same mental picture of what was going on, nor of what should be done. There were still multiple warnings going off together with master caution lights, and the speed and altitude was still way too high for a safe landing to be attempted. Basically, this was the definition of chaos. If ever there was an approach which needed a go-around, this was it. But instead, the captain just pressed ahead. The pitch was now manually lowered to -5 degrees, giving a descent rate of around 1,800 feet per minute. The speed was 220 knots, likely increasing, and they were more than 2 dots high on the glide slope as they passed the landing gate of 1,000 feet. This is where they should have been stabilized. On speed, altitude and thrust with all checklists complete in order to be able to continue the approach, but since none of the other standard operating procedures had been followed, neither was this one. I also think it's super important to point out here that the captain had likely been the one who had initially lowered the landing gear much earlier out on this approach, and he had now switched over to become pilot flying. But it was likely the first officer who had brought the gear up, whilst he was pilot flying, and none of them had verbalized any of these actions nor completed the landing checklists. So given the extreme stress and confusion which now dominated this cockpit, it is very possible that none of them were actually sure in what configuration the aircraft actually was. And that brings us down to the very last available barrier, built specifically to try and avoid disaster, and that's the aircraft's various warning systems. As the aircraft descended through 750 feet radio with flaps config 3 selected but the gear not down, the ECAM landing gear not down warning was triggered, together with a red arrow next to the landing gear selector. But since there were already several other cricket warnings already triggered, this new warning likely didn't add enough new stimulus to draw the pilot's attention. None of them had been dealing with the other ECAM warnings up until this point, and in the confusion and stress, it's unlikely that they would have noticed this red arrow either. But of course, there still was one more system, a system who definitely should catch their attention, and that was the ground proximity warning system. You see, it included a verbal "too low, gear" warning, which could wake and dead the pilot if it was activated, so surely this should be enough, shouldn't it? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the warning systems will prioritize different warnings depending on their severity and flight phase. This was also true for the GPWS system, who now was faced with a choice. As the aircraft continued barreling down towards the runway, the system could feel that the descent rate was way too high and that they were too close to the terrain. It could also feel that the landing gear was not extended, but given that the speed was still over 190 knots at that point, this fact was disregarded, since it didn't make any sense that anyone would try to land from that speed. So instead, the first "too low, terrain" caution started as the aircraft descended to 500 feet, and this was then followed by "pull up" warnings, several "too low, terrain" warnings, more "sink rate, pull up," and "too low, terrain," but no too low gear. These warnings continued to blare, basically all the way down to 24 feet over the runway, which is where all warnings were inhibited by design. The aircraft now roared in over the runway, still at a speed of over 200 knots and with the landing gear still retracted. This insane speed obviously caused it to overshoot the entire touchdown zone, and as the aircraft descended down through 7 feet, the captain selected full reverse on both engines. Now, those of you who saw my last episode know that the reversers will not activate until the weight on wheel switches on the main landing gear struts are compressed. And since those were now neatly tucked away in the retracted position, this was not going to happen. But the fact that the captain selected them while still airborne was another sign of his complete disregard for procedures. At time 14:34 and 28 seconds, both the aircraft engine nacelles touched down about 4,500 feet into runway 25 left. This obviously caused terrible vibrations inside of the cabin, and sparks immediately started shooting up as the concrete started grinding into the metal underside of the engines. In the cockpit, the captain reacted by pushing his stick fully forward and also by applying max manual braking, but since the gear was still retracted, this didn't help much at all. The engine nacelles continued bouncing on the runway surface, touching down a total of 4 times during the next 16 seconds, but the aircraft didn't decelerate much. Throughout this time, the first officer was giving 2/3 pitch-up commands on his side stick, indicating that he was wanting to go around, while the captain continued giving full nose-down input on his side, which meant that the inputs were averaged at a slight nose-down input. Of course, the engines were not designed to take up the amount of load that they were now subjected to, but the high speed meant that the full weight of the aircraft didn't push down on them either, something that would have likely caused them to just shear off. But on the underside of the engines, the auxiliary gearboxes and the transfer gearboxes are located, and this was the area where the concrete was now grinding in. The right engine, engine number 2, remained in contact with the runway the longest, and at time 14:34 and 37 seconds, with the reverses still selected in full reverse thrust, this caused an engine number 2 fire warning to suddenly erupt in the cockpit. At the same time, the number 2 engine also started spooling back, and its generator now failed, causing an electric system switch over to engine number 1. This was clearly catastrophic, but at least they were still on the runway and therefore close to emergency services. Had they just stayed in this configuration, they would have likely overshot the runway, but at least they would have been with a decent chance of survival. But that was sadly not to be. About 14 seconds after the initial touchdown, the first officer cried out, "Take off, sir!" And in the confusion, the captain just followed that advice. He now stopped applying braking, then moved the thrust levers from full reverse into the toga mode. Like I said before, the reverses had never really activated since they didn't feel the ground mode, but this action, the fact that he chose to go around after having selected reverse thrust, was still another huge neglect of standard operating procedures, especially since the fire warning was now also blaring in the cockpit. The number 1 engine now responded and started spooling up, and since the speed was still around 160 knots at this point, the aircraft almost immediately got airborne as soon as the captain started pulling back on his side stick. The number 2 engine had, like I said before, failed during the scraping against the ground, but now it went into an auto-start mode to try to get back online again. As the aircraft climbed through 59 feet, the first officer selected the flaps into config 2, which was the go-around setting, and the climb initially continued straight ahead. Interestingly though, since the speed was now below 190 knots, the GPWS system now called out, "Too low, gear." And this caused one of the pilots to immediately move the gear selector down, and then a couple of seconds later, back up again. Now, the gear never started extending during this event, but it shows how powerful that warning can be if it comes at the right time. The first officer now called up Karachi approach and declared that they were going around, and down on the airport, everyone had seen the huge sparks from the belly landing, so a full emergency had already been declared. Engine number 2 now slowly started recovering again, and when it did, it started indicating some quite big vibrations. The crew started accelerating and retracted all of the flaps, but if they would have looked down onto their engine displays, they would have seen that the engine oil levels on both engines were now quickly dropping. You see, the fact that the housing on the underside of both of these engines had now been sanded down into 2 huge holes meant that all of the engine oil was now gushing out through those holes. And even though these engines had shown incredible resilience up until this point, they were now operating on borrowed time. But the pilots were so far completely unaware of this. As they climbed through 500 feet, the thrust was reduced back to max continuous thrust for a few seconds before being pushed back up into toga again. Both engines responded accordingly to this command, but they were also showing very high levels of vibration. The captain now selected open climb and moved the thrust levers into the climb detent, but as the aircraft climbed through around 1200 feet, first engine number 2, then engine number 1, low oil pressure warnings were triggered, and those came also together with the associated master caution warnings and crickets. This was just cancelled by the crew, and at 2,160 feet, Autopilot 1 was connected as the aircraft continued climbing toward 3,000 feet. Karachi approach now called up the aircraft and cleared them to turn left onto a heading of 110 degrees and continue climbing to 3,000 feet for downwind for a new approach. But the controller didn't tell them about the observed belly landing. The crew read this back, but as they started turning, engine number 1 had finally had enough and now started failing. This was a serious issue because, remember, the engine number 2 generator had already failed down on the ground, so if engine number 1 now failed, there would be only the APU and the ram air turbine left to provide electrical power. But at this point, the almost non-existing CRM and situational awareness between these two pilots again reared its ugly head. Because at time 14:36 and 6 seconds, the first officer called out, "Thrust lever number 2 to idle, move number 2 to idle." Now it's unclear where this suddenly came from, but given that it was the number 2 engine who had the original engine fire indication, it's possible that this was now what he was dealing with. The problem though was of course that what he was now doing was reducing the thrust on the only engine that was still functioning. 10 seconds later, both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder stopped working since both the generators had now failed. This caused the ram air turbine to be deployed, which resumed the CVR, but not the data recorder. So from this point, we don't really know all of the details of what happened, more than what we could deduce from the cockpit voice recordings. Anyway, the aircraft continued flying downwind, and the highest indicated altitude was 3,140 feet. Since engine number 1 had now failed and engine number 2 was in idle, the aircraft started descending and also losing speed. Several cavalry charge alerts was now heard in the cockpit, together with 2 dual inputs and stall warnings. The aircraft was at 1,900 feet, descending on heading 103 degrees and with a ground speed of 222 knots when this happened, and the captain now asked the first officer where the runway was. The first officer just pointed this out, and seconds later a C-chord altitude alert could be heard. As this was going on, the Karachi tower controller called up his colleague, the approach controller, and asked him to confirm with the crew whether their gear was down or not. Now this will unfortunately lead to the very last piece of this horrific puzzle, which we will very soon see. The approach controller, who was still in contact with the aircraft, could now see that the aircraft was obviously descending and called them up pointing this out. The first officer just asked for a clearance to maintain 2,000 feet instead, which was obviously immediately approved, and several more cricket warnings could then be heard, to which the captain just responded by telling the first officer to just cancel them. A short discussion then followed about the status of the number 2 engine, which was confirmed to still be running. Then the next altitude warning could be heard, meaning that the crew was not maintaining the 2,000 feet that they had recently been cleared, and on the CVR, the number 2 engine could now be heard accelerating. The approach controller told the crew that he could see them descending through 1,800 feet, and the first officer responded with trying to maintain. The first officer then pointed out to the captain that the minimum speed for the ram air turbine was 140 knots and to try and remain that. And then he tried to reactivate the generators by cycling them off and then on again. At that same time, the captain asked the first officer if he had selected the number 2 engine to idle when the number 1 engine was the one who had failed, and the first officer just responded, yes. During the following 30 seconds, noises sounding similar to engine stalls could be heard, and the captain asked the first officer what those sounds were. The first officer responded with, "Reduce the speed," likely referring to the engine speed, and the captain followed up by asking the first officer to select flaps 1. This was briefly followed by another master caution chime. But the remaining number 2 engine was obviously also badly damaged at this point, lacking engine oil, so about 1 minute after this, all noises from this engine also disappeared. This means that from time 14:38 and 46 seconds, this aircraft was now flying without any engines and with only the ram air turbine providing power since the APU was never started. Several stall warnings could now be heard in the cockpit, followed by the first officer pleading with the captain to please increase the speed. The captain responded, "How would I increase the speed?" showing some real frustration here, whilst the aircraft still kept on descending. There was a brief discussion about the availability of a nearby military base before the Karachi approach controller came in and said, "It appears that you're turning left." The first officer responded, "We will be proceeding direct, sir. We have lost engines," and in the background another dual input could now be heard. And it is now that the last nail in the coffin likely came. Because at time 14:39 and 20 seconds, the Karachi approach controller asked, "Confirm you're carrying out a belly landing?" The first officer responded, "Negative, sir," but this was almost immediately followed by the captain asking if the gear was extended. When the first officer confirmed that the gear was not extended, a sound similar to the landing gear lever being moved down could almost immediately be heard. The aircraft was at this moment still relatively far away from the runway and flying at a relatively low speed. So to, in this situation, extend the gear would add an enormous amount of drag and significantly reduce the available glide distance. Judging from the conversation, it can be assumed that it was the captain who did this, and it's impossible to speculate about what he was thinking. But based on how he had been handling the rest of this flight up until this point, it is likely that this was just a split-second decision based on the controller's question, a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. The captain now told the first officer to seat the cabin crew, and whilst he was doing that, the captain also started calling out "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" into the thin air in the cockpit. The first officer proceeded by repeating this over the radio as they descended through 700 feet. Soon after this, the synthetic stall warning started and could then be heard continuously until the end of the recording. The aircraft was now turning left towards the runway, but it must now have become evident to the pilots that they weren't going to reach it. The Karachi controller informed them that all runways were available for landing, but in the cockpit, the situation was now becoming more and more desperate, with the stall and cricket warnings all going off simultaneously. As they descended through 400 feet, they were almost aligned with the runway, but still desperately far away. The captain called out, "Don't take flaps, don't take flaps," obviously trying to avoid any extra drag, but with the gear hanging out, that really didn't matter. At time 14, 40 and 18 seconds, the aircraft crashed into a densely populated residential area about 1,300 meters short of runway 25 left. The aircraft immediately broke apart and an intense fire erupted, which also engulfed several buildings around the crash site. Out of the 99 people inside of the aircraft, all but 2 perished in the crash, and 1 person on the ground was also fatally injured. The emergency services were immediately dispatched towards the site, but they were impeded by the narrow streets and a huge crowd of people who had now turned up to try to help. The cause of the accident was obviously found to be the non-adherence to standard operating procedures and disregard for air traffic control instructions by the 2 pilots. It was also found that the air traffic controllers should have advised the crew about the gear-up landing as soon as they saw it, since this might have helped the pilots to understand the severity of the issue. The fact that the pilots were fasting was another potential contributing factor, which has since been forbidden for flying personnel. But the fact here remains that blatant disregard for rules, procedures and CRM seems to have been a regular feature of this captain's way of flying. In my view, that shines a very harsh light onto the training and checking department in Pakistan International Airlines, as there is just no way that this type of behavior could have gone unnoticed. There were several recommendations coming out of this investigation, mainly aimed at the airline itself and the Pakistan aviation authorities, but in the wake of this investigation, shockingly, it was also found that 40% of the airline pilots working for Pakistan International Airlines were flying on fake licenses. This was not the case for the 2 pilots that were involved in this accident, but this astonishing revelation caused the airline to be blacklisted in both the EU and the United States until they could show significant improvement. On a personal note, this accident has left me feeling frankly both angry and shocked. We pilots are entrusted with the lives of our passengers and crew, and there is frankly no excuse for this type of incompetence. No aircraft systems, redundancies or warnings are enough if the pilots are not using them, and if you are an examiner out there, these are exactly the type of pilot traits that you and I are entrusted with keeping out of the cockpit. Have you ever been really humiliated by someone you work with? Do you remember how that felt and how that made you act in the minutes and hours after it happened? Now imagine that you have that feeling, but instead of sitting in an office, you are operating a heavy commercial aircraft in marginal weather, flying a really complicated maneuver around mountainous terrain, and suddenly things are starting to go really, really wrong. Stay tuned. A huge thank you to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this video. In the morning of the 28th of July 2010, Airblue Flight 202 was a scheduled domestic passenger service between Karachi and Islamabad in Pakistan. The aircraft being flown was a 4-year-old Airbus A321, which is the slightly stretched version of the very common Airbus A320 family. The flight was scheduled to carry 146 passengers, 4 cabin crew and 2 pilots. The weather in the morning was really miserable, with heavy rains, low clouds and reasonably poor visibility, and the weather has been like that for the previous 2 weeks prior to the flight. In fact, the weather had been so bad in Pakistan that it had triggered several floodings all over the country, and it was forecasted to be equally bad when the flight was due to land in Islamabad later in the morning. Now, in normal circumstances, rain and moderately bad visibility is not a problem, but the pilots were looking at their pre-flight briefing material and they realized that the surface wind was 070 degrees at 16 knots and it was forecasted to become even stronger later on. The runways available in Islamabad is runway 30 and runway 12. But the problem here is that there's only an instrument approach procedure into runway 30. This is because to the north of the runway there is a lot of mountainous terrain, which makes it impossible to construct an approach procedure from that direction. And with this wind, there was a possibility that the runway in use was going to be runway 12 because they couldn't land with that much tailwind. The only way to actually land on runway 12 would be for the pilots to execute an approach procedure into runway 30, and then, providing if the weather was good enough, they would have to do a visual circling maneuver to runway 12. A visual circling maneuver can be quite complicated for the crews to fly. It's something that we don't do very often, and it involves a lot of track keeping, timings, and also it is a visual maneuver, which means that you need to have quite good visibility, quite good weather in order to do it. And the way that Airblue instructed their crews to fly the circling procedure was to establish themselves on the inbound approach procedure. In this case in Islamabad it was going to be the ILS with gear down and flap 3 selected. They then had to descend down to their minimum descent altitude, which was going to be 2,500 feet, and providing that they had the runway environment in sight, they could then start braking to the right. They couldn't brake to the left because Islamabad city was there and it was not approved to fly over that, so they had to brake to the right 45 degrees. They have to do that using the selected heading mode on the Autopilot and then time for about 30 seconds outbound. Once those 30 seconds were out, they needed to turn downwind, fly to a beam the threshold, all the time keeping the runway environment in sight. Start the timing once a beam the threshold, fly for 20 seconds outbound and then turn left, select flaps full and then hopefully establish themselves at the latest 400 feet above the runway and land on runway 12. The reason that these timings are so important is because A, you need to keep yourself fairly tight, close to the runway in order to see the runway if the visibility is bad, but more importantly, the MDA, the minimum descent altitude, is calculated to give the crew a clearance area that stretches from about 4.2 nautical miles from each runway threshold. And within that area, you can maneuver and have at least 394 feet of clearance above the terrain, right? So it's really, really important when you do a visual circling maneuver like this that you stay within those 4.2 miles. And this is going to be really important very soon. The pilots would have been aware that there was a very real possibility that this was the type of procedure they were going to have to do once they reached Islamabad. And even though the minimum visibility to do the circling was only 2,400 meters, in reality, you need better visibility than that. And if you at any time during the circling maneuver lose contact with the runway, you're going to have to execute a go around and a missed approach. And the missed approach procedure you need to follow is the procedure from the approach that you flew before you broke off for the circling. This makes the missed approach procedure potentially also quite demanding. So the pilots would have been very aware that unless the weather became much better when they arrived, there was a very real possibility that this flight might end up in a diversion. The pilots that were scheduled to operate together on this flight had vastly different experience levels. The captain was a 61-year-old with close to 25,500 hours, which is a lot. He had around 1,000 hours of experience on the Airbus A320 family, and he had previously, just a few years earlier, worked for a different airline, but that airline had a mandatory retirement age of 60 years, and that's why he had switched over to Airblue. The first officer, on the other hand, was 34 years old and had around 1,900 hours of total experience, with only slightly less than 300 hours on the Airbus A320. Because of this, they decided during the pre-flight that the captain was going to be the pilot flying for the flight because of the complexity of the potential circling later on. This, by the way, makes perfect sense because they had to brake right for a left-hand circling, and that would mean that the runway would be outside of the captain's window, making it easier for him to see it. After the pilots had completed their planning, they briefed their cabin crew and they made their way out to the aircraft, where they checked the technical status of the aircraft, which they found to be in perfect working order. At time 0241, that's 7:41 local time, so quite early in the morning, Airblue Flight 202 took off from Karachi and started flying down towards Islamabad. About 11 minutes into the flight, the cabin crew came in and served the pilots a couple of croissants and some tea, and the captain apparently found that this was the perfect opportunity to start testing the technical and operational knowledge of the first officer. And remember, this was not a training flight. According to the final report, the captain did so in a very snobbish, degrading and humiliating way, and apparently he wasn't very happy with the answers he was getting from his much more junior first officer. So this grilling continued on and off for about 1 hour of the flight, and throughout this ordeal the first officer became more and more quiet, less and less involved in the conversation, as everyone can kind of understand. I want to take a moment here to really explain how potentially devastating behavior like this can be for the crew resource management inside of a cockpit. Remember, this first officer was not on the training, so he would not have been prepared to be grilled by his colleague while he was operating the aircraft. And even if this would have been a training flight, we in the training department, our job is to try to build up our colleagues, the people that we are training. So indeed, we might be asking the occasional questions just to probe the knowledge level of the ones that we are training, but if we find that there are deficiencies, we just note that down so they can be debriefed later on in order for them to increase their knowledge level. Never, ever, ever should you put yourself in a position where you make the other person feel smaller, feel worthless, and lose their self-confidence. Because if you do, you might find yourself in a situation where they could potentially help you. You are making mistakes, something is happening in the flight, but because they've lost all their confidence, they're not going to do that. And we are going to see a terrifying example of that very soon. Once the captain was finally done grilling the first officer, he told him to take the weather for Islamabad. First officer went on to the 80s frequency and received the weather, and as expected, it was just as bad as when they left. It did confirm that runway 12 was going to be the landing runway and that the wind was indeed favoring that runway. Visibility was about 3.5 kilometers with some low clouds around. This clearly made the captain quite nervous because he could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder confusing the arrival airport and holding patterns around with a completely different airport. But anyway, he started setting up the cockpit for the arrival procedure, but curiously, he didn't prepare for the company-approved circling procedure. Instead, he started setting up his flight management computer with waypoints that he created himself for a right-hand circling pattern, rather than the left-turn circling pattern that was approved. Now, this doesn't make much sense because the approach plate clearly states that there is a prohibited area just to the west of the airfield and that you're not allowed to overfly the city. But on top of that, he is sitting in the left seat, and if he were to brake left for a right-hand circling, it would mean that the airport would be on the first officer's side rather than his. Anyway, the captain continues to set up the cockpit for an approach in this way. The first officer sees this happening, but he doesn't say anything. And the captain starts creating these PBD FMC waypoints. Now, PBD stands for Point Bearing Distance. And basically, the way that you do this, if you want to make your own waypoints, is that you find a fixed point, and then you set a bearing and a distance from that point in order to create a new point. The captain is doing this because he is now trying to create a route that will bring him in towards a final for runway 12 without having to fly this really complicated company-stipulated circling procedure. Now, one of the problems with doing it this way is that when the FMC doesn't have an approach procedure for one runway, it will create a default point called a CF point, okay, center fix. This center fix point is by default 5 nautical miles away on the final for the runway that you want to come into. So when the captain is creating this right-hand pattern in for runway 12, he uses the threshold point and he creates a couple of points with bearing from the threshold. Then he connects these points into the CF points and then to the runway. But like I said, the CF point is 5 nautical miles away, which means that all of these other points that he's creating are also more than 5 miles away. Remember what I said about the protected area in case of a circling? That's 4.2 miles. So that means that this whole circuit that he's creating is actually outside of the protected area. And the CF point, by the way, the default point that the FMC has created, doesn't take any kind of terrain or anything into account. It's just a default point. Now, before we go any further, it's really important that you guys understand how the pilots operate the autopilot in the Airbus. So the autopilot is controlled from something called a mode control panel on the glare shield. Up there, the pilots can choose to either have the aircraft flying according to what we call a managed mode. This is what you think about when you think about an autopilot. It's the aircraft basically flying a pre-programmed route and the pre-programmed profile that is optimal. Or they might want to fly it in a selected mode. This is where the pilot actually tells the aircraft exactly what they want it to do. For example, they wanted to fly a specific heading or track, or maybe they want to fly a specific vertical speed or something like that. There are many reasons why pilots might want to go from a managed mode to a selected mode. It could be that they want to divert around a thunderstorm cell, for example, or like what we're talking about today, fly a circling maneuver. Now, if the pilots want to go out from a managed nav mode into a selected heading mode, what they do is they set the heading that they want on the mode control panel, and then they pull out the heading selector. When they do so, the autopilot will understand that, okay, the pilots now want me to turn on to that heading, and it's going to turn in the shortest possible direction towards whatever heading that the pilots have selected. If the pilots then, after the aircraft has to turn, they want to go back into a managed mode, well then they are going to have to put it onto an intercept heading to the track and then push the heading selector back in again. That is going to tell the autopilot that, okay, now the pilots want me to intercept the route that we were flying and then follow the route onwards. In order to understand what's about to happen in the story, it's really important for you to understand the difference between those two modes and how the pilots are supposed to be manipulating the autopilot. When the captain was finally done with his briefing, he told his first officer to ask for descent. And at time 03:48 and 17 seconds, the aircraft received its first descent clearance from its cruise altitude of 33,000 feet down towards Islamabad. About 6 minutes later, the air traffic controller came back and said that they could expect radar vectors for an ILS approach runway 30 with a circuit to land runway 12. This was read back by the first officer, who once again asked if it would be possible for them to do a right-hand circling instead of a left-hand circling. Air traffic control came back and said that no, that is not possible due to local restrictions. Expect a right-hand turn for a left-hand circling. This meant that all of the waypoints that the captain had created during his setup, which was reliant on a left-hand turn to circle on the west side of the airport, was now not going to be usable. So as they were descending in now, the captain told the first officer to create similar waypoint to the east of the airport instead. First officer didn't seem to mind to do this. He went in and he created these PBD waypoints based on the runway threshold and the CF point. They were called PBD 10, 11 and then to the CF point, kind of creating a pattern-like route. But like I mentioned before, these waypoints and this route that was now being created looked nothing like the circling that they were supposed to fly. And in fact, if they would have looked close onto it, they would have noticed that this route would take them deep inside of the Margalla Hills, where the terrain was actually much higher than the minimum descent altitude that they were about to descend down to. At time 04:34, Airblue Flight 202 received their final vector and a descent clearance to 3,900 feet to intercept the ILS approach for runway 30. The crew read this back, they started selecting some flaps to slow the aircraft down, and once they were established on the ILS, they were transferred over to Islamabad Tower. Now it's important to point out here that Islamabad Tower did not have their own radar screen, so the previous sector could see the aircraft on the radar, but the tower could not. As the aircraft was descending down the glide slope, the crew once again asked the tower for the weather conditions on the right-hand downwind for runway 12. The tower once again pointed out that the right-hand downwind was not going to be available. They would have to turn right for a left-hand downwind. The pilots had set their altitude selector to 2,500 feet, which is the minimum descent altitude for the circling. But during the descent on the glide slope, the captain suddenly reached over and set 2,000 feet instead. This was actually picked up by the first officer, who said, no, the MDA is 2,500 feet like we briefed, and the altitude selector was set back up again. But this indicates already here that the captain was willing to descend lower than the MDA, possibly because the lower down the glide slope you could come, the more of a chance you have to actually see the runway, because you're getting closer to runway. But that would also mean that he would have less descent clearance during the actual circling maneuver, and it shows a bit of a mindset of the captain. At time 04:37 and 3 seconds, the aircraft levels off at 2,500 feet without having made visual contact with the runway. The captain engages the selected heading mode, and they continue flying straight ahead towards the Romeo November VOR beacon, which is the missed approach point. That's the latest point at which they have to be able to see the runway in order to brake for the circling. If they haven't seen anything by then, they need to execute a go-around. During the short flight towards the VOR, the tower controller comes in and tells the crew that another aircraft has just managed to land on runway 12. It's likely that that information would have been fed into the minds of the pilots, making them think that, well, if they could land, then definitely so can we as well. Maybe the weather is better than we think it is. What the tower did not tell them was that that aircraft has managed to land on runway 12 on its third attempt. And another aircraft that tried it just prior to them diverted due to the bad weather. Anyway, just as the aircraft is about to reach the Romeo November beacon, the pilot can see the runway ahead of them, and the captain, in selected heading mode, turns the aircraft right onto a track of 352 degrees. The tower controller, who can also see the aircraft at this point, calls them up and tells them to call him on downwind so that he can issue the landing clearance for runway 12. The tower controller also tells them to consider doing a bad weather circuit, possibly referring to making the circuit as tight as possible because of the bad visibility. But in response to that, the captain inside of the cockpit just mutters to the first officer, let him say whatever he wants to say, possibly indicating that he has some plans of his own. Soon after this, the captain also reaches over and reduces the altitude selector from 2,500 feet to 2,300 feet. The first officer doesn't speak up this time, and the aircraft starts descending. This is now violating the minimum descent altitude during the circling and reducing the available terrain clearance for the aircraft. The next thing that happens is that the captain now tells the first officer that he intends to go into the managed nav mode, following the route that the first officer created before. But he doesn't actually engage the nav mode. Instead, he continues in the selected heading mode, going outbound on a heading of 352 degrees. The first officer says, okay, sir, but are you visual? And the captain responds, visual line, okay. And the aircraft continues to fly outbound, further and further away from the airport. And the captain explains to the first officer that he wants to fly to the PBD 11 point, where he's going to select flaps 3 and then flaps full as they're turning in towards the CF point. This is clearly showing that the captain is fully intending to fly this programmed route that they have created and not the company specified circling procedure that they're supposed to fly. They're now also so far away from the airport that it's impossible that the captain has the runway in sight, further violating the procedure. At times 04:39 and 32 seconds, the captain turns the heading bug to 300 degrees. This makes the aircraft parallel the landing runway, and it's now heading straight towards their created waypoint PBD 11. As he's doing so, he also pushes in the heading selector. This engages the managed nav mode, so from this point onward, the aircraft is going to try to follow whatever route is in the FMC. They're now at about 3.5 miles away from the runway, and they're out of sight from tower and quickly becoming closer to the outer limit of the 4.2 nautical mile protected circling area. As this is happening, the radar controller has been looking at the aircraft on his radar screen, and he realizes that it's not where it's supposed to be. It's actually getting very close to a restricted area called OP277. But because the tower controller doesn't have his own radar screen, he's not aware of this. So the radar controller calls up the tower and asks him what the aircraft is doing. This prompts the tower controller to call up the aircraft and tell them to immediately turn left to avoid flying into the restricted area. And from this point onwards, things are going to start happening very, very quickly. Within a few seconds from this call, the first
terrain ahead
warning is issued in the cockpit. This warning is issued by the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, and that system uses a global terrain database together with the aircraft GPS position, its attitude and its flight path to predict closure rates to terrain. This warning is issued when the aircraft is about 60 seconds from a potential collision with terrain, and it is definitely not something that you should ever hear during normal circumstances. If you hear this warning, the correct thing to do is to immediately change your flight path, either by turning or by climbing, and definitely verify your own position, because under no circumstances should you be in a position where a terrain warning like this would occur. As this first warning is heard, the first officer speaks up and he says, "Sir, the higher ground has reached. Sir, there is terrain ahead. Sir, turn left." The captain can now be heard on the cockpit voice recorder becoming jittery and stressed. This was clearly not something that he had anticipated. And it's likely that these increased stress levels that is now hitting him further degrades his situational awareness, because the aircraft just continues flying towards the waypoint. The tower controller now calls up the aircraft and asks the pilots to please confirm that they're still visual with the runway. And the first officer doesn't know what to respond to this, so he just turns over to the captain and asks, "What should I tell him?" And when the tower controller repeats the same question again, both pilots goes onto the frequency at the same time and said, "Affirm, Airblue flight 202, we're visual with the terrain," which is not the same as being visual with the runway. The first officer is now becoming more and more anxious, which frankly anyone can understand, and he calls, "Sir, the terrain head is coming." That is further accompanied by 2 more EGPWS warnings, and to that the captain finally responds, "Yes, we're turning," and he's starting to turn the heading bug to the left. But this is where the captain makes one of the biggest mistakes so far. Because remember, the aircraft is now flying in the managed nav mode towards the waypoint that they have created. The captain turns the heading bug, but that doesn't really do anything, because the autopilot still thinks that they want to continue with the route. In order for the autopilot to understand that the captain now wants to turn, he would have had to pull the heading selector out to switch it from the managed to the selected mode, but he doesn't do this. And in the stress that captain is now likely feeling, he just keeps turning the bug more and more to the left until it actually ends up on a heading of 086 degrees. This is where the captain finally pulls out the heading selector, switching it over to the selected mode instead. But remember, the heading is now set to 086 degrees. The aircraft is on a heading of 300 degrees. This means that the quickest way for the aircraft to turn to the selected heading is not left like the captain wants it to do, it is right. And that's what the aircraft is doing. It starts turning to the right, bringing the aircraft further into the Margalla Hills, further in towards the higher terrain. Now, more and more terrain ahead EGPWS warnings can be heard in the cockpit, and they subsequently turn into
terrain ahead, pull up.
Whenever you have an oral pull-up warning in any cockpit, there's only one thing that you should be doing as a pilot, and that is the terrain escape maneuver. In the Airbus, that means disconnecting the autopilot, pitching up to max aft side stick, adding full toga thrust, taking down any speed brake if you're using them, and also rolling wings level. If that procedure would have been followed, there is a possibility that they might have been able to clear the terrain ahead, but unfortunately none of this is being done. The first officer can now be heard pleading, "Sir, turn left, sir, pull up, sir, pull up." But it doesn't go as far as to actually take controls from the clearly confused and bewildered captain and execute the terrain escape maneuver himself. At time 0440 and 33 seconds, there is some indications that the captain is doing a meager effort to try to comply with the terrain warning. He moves the thrust levers into the flex detent, which is not toga, but it increases the thrust, and it also disconnects the auto throttle. He also sets 3,700 feet in the altitude selector, and this causes the aircraft to start climbing. But only seconds later, he reduces the altitude back down to 3,100 feet, and he brings the thrust levers back into climb thrust again, which once again re-engages the auto thrust. On the hills below, a couple of eyewitnesses could see the aircraft screaming above them at a shockingly low altitude. In the cockpit, the first officer continues to plead with the captain, "Sir, pull up!" But the captain seems to still be in the mindset to get this aircraft down on the ground. He continues to turn the heading bug more and more to the left, ending up at a value of 0.25 degrees. But since that's still in the mind of the autopilot, indicating a right-hand turn, that's what the aircraft continues to do. At time 0440 and 46 seconds, the captain finally decides to take matters into his own hands. He disconnects the autopilot and he induces full left side stick together with some left rudder, and those two actions together causes a rapid roll to the left up to a maximum value of 52 degrees. At that time, the aircraft was actually climbing at 2,770 feet and it reached as high as 3,110 feet before the combination of the high bank angle and the captain now inputting forward side stick, causing the aircraft to start descent. And the descent reaches 3,000 feet per minute with a negative attitude of 4.6 degrees. Since the auto thrust was now re-engaged, the fact that the aircraft is now pitching forward causes the engines to spool back in order to try to maintain the airspeed, causing further pitch down. This increasing descent rate, together with the roll and the already low terrain clearance, now made this accident unavoidable. And the last thing that was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder was the first officer meekly speaking up, saying, "Sir, we are going down. Sir, we are going down." And then the recording stops. At time 0441 and 8 seconds, the aircraft crashes into the Margala Hills, 9.6 miles away from the airport at an altitude of 2,858 feet. All 146 passengers and 6 crew members perish in the accident. The final report that came out of this investigation is one of the shortest and least complete ones that I've ever seen in connection to a modern aviation accident. It lacks the normal root cause analysis that is so important in order for us to learn something from an accident like this. What it is basically a chronological description of what happened during this flight based on the cockpit voice recorder, and they lay the blame of this accident almost squarely on the captain and his lack of CRM, primarily during the initial part of the flight where he completely obliterates the self-confidence of the first officer, and then obviously during the actual circling maneuver and his lack of discipline and not following standard operating procedures. But they also mentioned that the first officer was overly passive and that he should have taken controls and done something about the situation when he recognized the danger that they were facing. The problem though is that the final report never goes into whether or not this was a cultural issue that existed within the airline, whether or not this captain had had previous problems with the CRM, or whether other pilots within the company was used to doing this unorthodox procedure of trying to fly a circling maneuver in a managed nav mode rather than in the described heading mode that they were supposed to do it. So we never really get to learn anything from this. The recommendations included things like building of a new airport in Islamabad and more emphasis on CRM training and checking within the airline, but it's very vague and it doesn't really help. Despite the very limited value that we got from this final report, I just want to use this accident as an example of how important your leadership skills and your team building and crew resource management skills are if you're in any type of leadership position, be it in a cockpit or in an office somewhere. You have to continuously be building your team members up, making sure that they're all helping you to pull in the same direction, and crucially making sure that they are willing and feel that they can speak up no matter what the situation is. If they don't feel that, and if you don't build up your team members, you might find yourself in a situation like the captain did in this accident, where something is going wrong, you're losing control of the situation, and where your team members should be there to give you a helping hand, in this case the first officer taking over control and executing the terrain escape maneuver, they won't be there for you when you need them the most.
Like in a nightmare, so many things went wrong here on so many levels. But why? What actually happened? Stay tuned. I often get asked which the safest and least safe airline in the world is, and I always answer the same thing. All airlines are forced to follow very similar standards, so as long as they are allowed to operate, they are all safe. there are some out there who definitely get into more accidents than others, and one of them is the Colombian airline Aerosucre. This is a cargo airline that has been serving less developed parts of Colombia since all the way back in 1969. And they have done so using a fleet that has varied over the years, but now consists of several Boeing 727s as well as 737-200s, 300s and 400s. Since it was founded, Aerosucre has had 11 fatal accidents and many more non-fatal ones, meaning that the airline has actually written off significantly more airplanes over its history than it has ever owned at any given time. For example, back in 1989, 5 crew and 2 people on the ground died when an Aerosucre Caravelle suffered a load shift, lost control and then crashed into several houses. And later that same year, another Aerosucre flight flew straight into a mountain, killing 6 people. Then in 1991, 2 persons died and several were injured when an Aerosucre DC-6 landed short of the runway in Barranquilla, and that flight, which was supposed to be a pure cargo flight, turned out to also be carrying at least 19 unauthorized passengers who had all gotten handwritten tickets through relatives that worked with the company. And these poor passengers had, according to reports, been sitting on the floor of the cargo area next to some crates of newspapers during the crash, since there were no seats fitted. Later, another deadly accident took place in 2006 when an Aerosucre 727 on approach hit a radio tower, killing all 6 crew members on board. And if that wasn't enough, they have also written off quite a few aircraft due to landing gear collapses. Plus, they've had a number of other emergencies, like in 2021 when the cargo door of the 737 came open in flight. Now, it is important to keep in mind that throughout most of Aerosucre's existence, Colombia has been embroiled in a long-running civil war that strained its infrastructure and oversight, so it wasn't always easy to operate safely, even if they were trying. And that's a big if. Now, despite their poor safety record, Aerosucre provides a vital service to some remote towns and cities in Colombia that would otherwise struggle to maintain supplies of basic goods or be unable to export their local products to market. And for that reason, Aerosucre's longtime owner was actually given a state award in 2013 for service to the country. But 2 years after receiving that award, he himself nearly died in a plane crash where he was pilot flying. Anyway, this is just supposed to give you some background, which might make the story that I'm about to tell you a bit easier to understand. And for that story, we need to go back to the 20th of December of 2016. On that day, an Aerosucre Boeing 727 and its crew were scheduled to operate a round trip between El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá to Germán Otano Airport in the remote town of Puerto Carreño, situated in the far eastern part of the country. Puerto Carreño is located along the Orinoco River, which forms part of Colombia's border with Venezuela, and Germán Olano Airport is actually surrounded by Venezuelan territory on 3 sides. When the inbound flight arrived at the airport, they flew the approach from the Colombian side, using runway 07, like most aircraft who use this airport tends to do, and that's an issue that I'll get back to later. Anyway, after the aircraft landed at 14:48 local time, the crew then supervised the ground personnel as they unloaded 9,300 kilograms of perishable foods and sundries to resupply the town. That was then followed by the loading of 9 pallets containing 19,800 kilograms of local products going for export, meaning that the crew knew that they would be substantially heavier on the homebound flight than they had been when they arrived. But who were the crew members who were operating on this afternoon then? Well, we don't actually know that much about them, except that they were supposed to be 5 crew members on board: a captain, a first officer, a flight engineer, a mechanic, and finally a loadmaster. The captain was 58 years old and had 8,708 total flying hours, including 6,822 hours on the Boeing 727. But he was the only crew member whose full records were actually available. The first officer was 39 years old, and according to Aerosucre's company records, he had 3,285 hours, all of which had been flown on the Boeing 727, but there were no record of any experience he might have gained before joining the company. Lastly, the flight engineer was 72 years old and had 1,612 hours on the Boeing 727 at Aerosucre, but again, there was no information about what he had done before that, and he had joined Aerosucre in 2013, 3 years before this flight, so he almost certainly had extensive experience with previous employers given his age. And when we're on the subject of his age, the fact that he was 72 years old might surprise a few of you guys out there, since pilots normally retire by either 60 or 65 years old. Well, it turns out that in a lot of countries, there actually is no age limit for flight engineers, and even in the places where there is a limit, it's often much higher than it is for pilots. In fact, in the United States, it used to be somewhat common for captains who had aged out of the left seat to become flight engineers so that they could keep flying for a couple of more years. But having said that, 72 definitely makes him the oldest flight engineer that I've ever heard of in active duty. As for the mechanic and the loadmaster, we don't know anything about them at all, and that's likely because their roles didn't make much of a difference to the outcome of this story. Interestingly though, while the flight was only supposed to have 5 crew members, a 6th person was later found to have been on board, and the sources we have looked at doesn't say who that person was. But it might have been an undocumented passenger, since Aerosucre had, like I mentioned earlier, a history of carrying those. The aircraft they were operating on this day was a 41-year-old beautiful 3-engine Boeing 727-200, which had been originally manufactured back in 1975. It had then been operated for many years in the United States before it was retired in 2007, at which point Aerosucre bought it and re-registered it in Colombia, possibly to replace one of the company's other 727s that had crashed a year earlier. Then in 2015, Aerosucre modified this aircraft according to a third-party retrofit package called Quiet Wing, which came with a supplemental type certificate, basically an addition to the original Boeing 727 type specifications approved by the FAA. The idea behind the Quiet Wing was to reduce the amount of noise generated during takeoff and landing, and also to improve its performance. This was done in part by adding new takeoff flap settings, which would allow the 727 to take off from shorter runways using lower speeds and therefore requiring less engine power and fuel. On the standard 727, the maximum takeoff flap setting was 25 degrees, but with the Quiet Wing modifications, it now became possible to also take off with flaps 30. Now, the flap settings that we pilots choose to use affects how we determine the takeoff, or V speeds, that is V1, the decision speed, VR, rotation speed, and V2, the safe engine out speed. Generally speaking, the higher the flap setting, the lower these speeds will become, since the wings will be able to provide more lift and therefore allow the aircraft to get airborne earlier. But with the addition of flaps 30, this also meant that the flight crew needed a new set of tables in order to determine these V speeds, tables taking weight, temperature, and wind into account. The designers of the Quiet Wing modification had provided a supplement to the aircraft flight manual that included instructions for how to calculate these new V-speeds with flaps 30, which Aerosucre should have used to then develop new quick reference takeoff cards for its pilots. These cards allow the pilots to quickly reference the required takeoff speeds without having to flip through pages and pages in the performance manuals and pore over complicated charts. But Aerosucre had never made these new takeoff cards, so the only way that the pilots could determine the correct flap 30 V-speed was by examining those charts in the manuals, which was pretty inconvenient on a daily basis. Now, to me, as someone who flies in a well-regulated environment, it's almost inconceivable that an airline would fail to do something that basic. But not only did Aerosucre fail to do this, apparently Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority didn't exercise any oversight of the modification process at all, even though they signed off on it, meaning that they also failed to catch this obvious error. But that wasn't the only major problem with Aerosucre's 727 operation into Germán Olano Airport. Because it turns out that they actually never had permission to fly this particular aircraft in there in the first place. You see, the runway width and pavement strength at the airport were both below the minimum values required for the Boeing 727, so it wasn't actually legal to conduct routine 727 operations there at all. Now, like any airline, Aerosucre had to acquire operational authorization from the civil aviation authorities for the relevant country, in this case Colombia, for every aircraft type and route combination that they intended to fly. But the operational authorization document approved by Colombia's CAA clearly specified that only Boeing 737 operations were permitted at Germán Olano Airport. And despite this, Aerosucre just ignored that and started flying there with its 727s anyway. And not only that, before every flight, the airline submitted a flight plan to the CAA for air traffic control purposes. And these flight plans seem to have then been just approved, apparently without any checking which aircraft type was actually being used. Now, neither the runway width nor the pavement strength was a factor in this accident, but obviously, if the regulations had been properly enforced, this flight would have never taken place, and this accident would therefore have been prevented. It is worth pointing out here that aviation is as safe as it is today because we build safety margins into every part of the operation. That ethos is supposed to start at the international level and then move down through the national regulators out to the airlines and then finally to the operating crews through laws, regulations, procedures and training. When this works well, there are so much margins in there that a singular or even several errors can slip through without something really bad happening. But when these rules are ignored, then the margins are thinned out until finally it comes down to a singular human mistake. After the cargo was loaded, the crew of Aerosucre Flight 157 carried out their pre-flight checks and then started up the 727's 3 Pratt & Whitney JT8 Delta engines. Once they were up and running, that also activated the cockpit voice recording, which means that we know what was said in the cockpit from that point onwards. The time was now 1700 and the control tower had actually closed for the day at 1500, meaning that the airport was now uncontrolled. So, to let other aircraft know their intentions, the first officer sent out a blind message addressed to all aircraft in the Puerto Carreño area on the common terminal frequency. And he stated Flight 157's intention to taxi to the active runway via taxiway Bravo. The pilots then completed their standard control checks and also double-checked the takeoff items, including flaps, which they had set to the maximum 30 degrees in order to help them take off from the short, 1,800-meter-long runway. They also reviewed the previously calculated engine power settings, or EPRs, and the captain then called out a value of 23 for both V1 and VR. He likely meant 123 knots here, but the first officer corrected him to 127 knots, which is what they had calculated before. After accepting that, the captain, who was going to be pilot flying for the leg, then conducted a takeoff briefing in which he explained that the flight engineer would add takeoff power, the first officer would then call out 60 and 80 knots, then V1 and VR at 127 knots, and finally V2 at 141 knots. He also discussed who would monitor the instruments and what they would do in the event of an engine failure both before and after decision speed, so far, so good. Now, there are 3 things about this briefing that is worth pointing out before we continue. The first is that the V-speeds they were using corresponded to an aircraft weight of 75,300 kilos, but the cargo and fuel information suggested that the weight of the aircraft was only 74,200 kilos, a full 1.1 ton less. Based on the runway length and the outside temperature of 31 degrees Celsius, the maximum takeoff weight for this runway would have been 74,700 kilos, which was higher than the aircraft's actual weight calculated by investigators. But it was apparently very common for Aerosucre to overload its aircraft with extra cargo that wasn't on the manifest in order to make the takeoff weight appear to be within limits. So the crew possibly used V-speeds corresponding to 75,300 kilos in order to account for this. It's hard to know for sure. Now, the higher V-speeds resulting from using this higher weight would have slightly extended the takeoff roll, but it was still possible to take off even with a 600 kilo overweight. But here we come to the second problem, because it turns out that the speeds selected by the crew were actually for a flaps 25 takeoff and not a flaps 30 takeoff. This was probably because, remember, Aerosucre hadn't updated the takeoff card for flaps 30, so the pilots were just using the flaps 25 speeds from the old takeoff cards instead. Now, this should be safe since those speeds were actually higher, but if the crew would have used the correct V-speeds here, then the V1 and VR speeds would have been 122 instead of 127 knots, allowing them to rotate 5 knots sooner. Investigators later calculated that in the time required to accelerate these extra 5 knots, the aircraft would eat up an extra 103 meters of runway, which on a runway that's short isn't really something they could afford. Now, the next thing I want to note about the captain's takeoff briefing is what wasn't in it. A takeoff briefing should include discussions of the runway in use, possibly the weight, but definitely the existing weather conditions and wind. At the time the aircraft was taxiing out, the runway in use for takeoff was runway 07, since the wind was out of the northeast. But at this point, the crew hadn't discussed the weather conditions at all. In fact, on this day, Aerosucre's dispatch department never provided Flight 157 with any weather information at all before departure, and the tower was, like I mentioned, closed. So as the pilots were taxiing out towards runway 25, the opposite runway than the one that was in use, the captain actually asked, don't know what the wind is, but none of the other crew members even acknowledged him. A few moments later he asked, but it's light, yes or no? To which the first officer replied, yeah, it is light. Apparently, the pilots had decided, without much data to back it up, that the wind was light enough that they didn't even have to take it into account, even though there was a weather office that they could have called in order to get the actual wind information. Now, this is the attitude that most of us have when we're out driving our cars. Maybe we'll glance outside before we go to see if it's sunny, raining or snowing, and then we might modify our driving style a little bit depending on what we see, but that's about it. Most of the time that's absolutely fine, but sometimes we end up in a ditch and we need a tow because it was just a little bit more slippery than we thought. In an aircraft though, we just can't afford to operate that way. Remember what I said about margins earlier on? We should always make sure that we have the margins with us and not against us. So when we fly, we have to be super diligent with all details, like the wind. In this case, there was a 4-knot wind out of the northeast, which slightly favored runway 07 for takeoff instead of runway 25, which the crew were now going for. Now 4 knots isn't a lot, but when you are an overweight 727 taking off from a 1,800 meter runway with V speeds that are too high, it just means again smaller margins. The pilots likely noticed that there was a light tailwind from runway 25 because they taxied past a windsock on their way out to the takeoff position, but that didn't change their minds. Now there are a few factors that I think could possibly have contributed to that decision. You see, taking off from runway 07 wasn't as simple as using runway 25, not only because it pointed away from the destination, but also because of the proximity to the Venezuelan border, located only 2.8 kilometers away from the departure end of runway 07. Now, I can't say for sure whether there were any airspace restrictions or anything like that, but flight radar data shows that most flights using Germán Molano Airport do take off from runway 25, and the few that uses runway 07 often execute a very sharp turn right after takeoff, likely to minimize entry into Venezuela. It's quite possible that entering Venezuelan airspace requires some extra paperwork or communication with air traffic control, which the pilots could have been aware of. Now, 2 other aircraft did take off from runway 07 shortly before Flight 157 departed, but these were a Cessna 208 and an Embraer 170, which are much smaller and more maneuverable, and could therefore probably have made a turn that the heavier 727 just would not be able to do. In any case, whatever the reason was, the crew was probably used to taking off from runway 25 unless the tailwind was very strong, so as long as they perceived it to be light, they likely didn't worry too much about it. But investigators later calculated that 4-knot tailwind would add another 146 meters to the takeoff distance, so things were now starting to add up. After completing the before takeoff checklist, the pilots taxied up to the head of runway 25 and then made a 180-degree turn, during which the first officer again announced their intentions over the common frequency. As soon as they were lined up, the captain called for takeoff thrust to be set, and the flight engineer advanced the thrust levels to the predetermined EPRs. So at time 17:18, they started accelerating down the runway. At this point, local plane spotters had gathered at the far end of the runway to watch the sleek 727 takeoff, and it was no coincidence that they were there to watch this particular flight. Aerosucre had a history of dramatic takeoffs from this particular runway, where on multiple occasions their 727s and 737s had been filmed making very long takeoff rolls, overflying plane spotters by just a few meters. And on at least 2 of these occasions, the aircraft had also nearly struck the 2-meter-high perimeter fence located 60 meters past the runway end, as well as a tree and a military guard post 76 meters further downrange. These earlier passes had been so close that they had enveloped the plane spotters in clouds of dust and left the tree branches swaying. So, for some of the enthusiasts positioned right at the end of runway 25, this was probably a bit of a thrill-seeking adventure. And they ended up getting way more than they had bargained for. I also want to add here that the placement of that fence, tree and guard post also didn't comply with international obstacle clearance regulations, since they penetrated into something known as the protected takeoff area. This area is defined by a specific slope starting from the runway end, and any obstacle that penetrates this slope has to be either removed or shortened, or if that can't be done, they must be mentioned on the airport charts and included in the aircraft's takeoff performance calculations. But here, none of that had been done, which again highlights the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority's lack of proper enforcement, as well as another safety margin removed. Anyway, the existence of multiple videos of aircraft nearly striking these obstacles also says a lot about Aerosucre's operations. Since their planes had been filmed nearly overrunning this very same runway at least twice, we have to ask ourselves why, and how many times that this has happened without it being caught on camera. Every aircraft must be able to pass the departure and runway at a minimum altitude of 35 feet, even after an engine failure, but that was clearly being routinely violated here. This leads me to believe that the excess weight, wrong V-speeds and disregard for the weather were probably also present on countless previous flights, leading flight crews to become accustomed to operating with little or maybe even no margin for error. I can see how it can be tempting to dismiss the significance of 600 kilos here, 5 knots difference in rotation speed there, a 4-knot tailwind here. But the problem is that these little variations are only academic until they suddenly aren't. Now, even with these factors in place, Flight 157 should still have been able to become airborne just before the end of the runway, and if that would have happened, we probably wouldn't be talking about this flight right now. But unfortunately, there was still one last thing that tipped them over the edge. Remember? That one human mistake? As the 727 began to accelerate down the runway, the first officer soon called out, "Speed alive," and then 60 knots. The captain replied, "Check," followed by the first officer calling out 80 knots and also reaffirming that the decision and rotation speed were both at 127 knots. 12 seconds later, the first officer called out V1, rotate, and the captain began to rotate the aircraft, but he did so very, very slowly. The standard rotation rate on the Boeing 727 is about 2 to 3 degrees per second until the aircraft gets airborne at around 8 to 10 degrees. But here, the captain rotated at only 1 degree per second, less than half of the proper rate, and that effectively doubled the time required to reach the takeoff angle. During that time, the aircraft consumed another 134 meters of extra runway, only now they didn't have those 135 meters to spare. 7 seconds after the rotation call, Flight 157 ran off the end of the paved runway with its nose in the air and just barely becoming airborne as it crossed a short stretch of grass. But it was now far too late to avoid those other obstacles at the end of the runway. The rear fuselage soon crushed the airport perimeter fence as the airplane streaked across the road where the plane spotters now desperately threw themselves out of the way. And through some miracle, none of them were actually hurt. The airplane then continued its trajectory forward, where it struck both a tree and the guard post with its right main landing gear, right trailing edge flaps, and the number 3 engine, raising a huge cloud of dust and scattered debris as it did so. Despite these impacts and the massive damage it caused, the airplane then started climbing, with several alarms and warnings blaring in the cockpit. Now, the cockpit voice recorder cut out for about 10 seconds right after the impact, so we don't know exactly what the pilot's initial reaction was to the collision. But when it came back online, the captain exclaimed, "Number 3 went! Engine 3, brother!" The first officer asked to confirm that engine number 3 had actually failed, and the captain confirmed that, yeah, that's what he meant. But the total extent of the damage to the aircraft was much worse than the pilots probably realized. Not only had the number 3 engine on the right side ingested loads of debris and therefore failed, but one of the right trailing edge flaps had also been completely removed, and the entire right main landing gear, with its door still attached, had been entirely torn off and thrown more than 400 meters away from the point of impact. The loss of the right main landing gear was especially devastating because it severed hydraulic lines belonging to both of the 727's redundant hydraulic system A and B, which now quickly started losing pressure. Now you might ask how it was possible that damage to one landing gear could end up depleting both hydraulic systems, but this had to do with the fact that whilst the landing gear retraction was handled by hydraulic system A alone, the brakes were handled primarily by system B. And it is hard to design a system with redundancy for entire airplane parts being ripped off. So the aircraft was now climbing, but in a very precarious state, with the partial loss of lift on the right wing, loss of thrust on the right engine, and rapidly depleting hydraulic pressures. As the aircraft struggled to gain altitude, the ground proximity warning system repeatedly started announcing "Caution, terrain," and the captain soon suggested that they should turn around for an immediate landing, even though they were well over maximum landing weight. Now, thinking about a plan is generally a good idea, but they were nowhere near that stage in their decision making. Instead, here it was all about keeping the aircraft in the air, aviating in other words. The first officer now tried to raise the gear, and it turns out that there actually was enough pressure left to raise the remaining bogies, but the right gear obviously indicated unsafe since it was no longer attached to the airplane. When he saw that, the first officer called out, "Right gear!" But at the same time, the captain also said, "Shut down engine number 3, whilst the flight engineer called out, "I lost hydraulic A." This was a truly chaotic nightmare situation, and when faced with something like this, something known as short-term decision-making is put to the test. That's when there isn't enough time to reach for checklists or fully discuss what's going on. Instead, the actions need to be prioritized and executed based on experience, training, and technical knowledge. But if any of those are lacking, like in this case where the crew was faced with multiple failures likely never seen together in a training scenario, panic can very quickly start to set in, and when there is panic, bad decisions will be taken. As the captain tried to figure out what to do next, the first officer suggested that they lower the gear again, and without almost any hesitation, the captain just agreed. Now, this course of action really makes no sense if you think about it. With the airplane struggling to climb due to the loss of lift and thrust, the last thing you want is to extend the landing gear, since that would immediately increase the drag and make it even harder to maintain the safe airspeed and keep the airplane under control. But given the captain's very fast reaction to the first officer's suggestion, it seems likely that putting the gear back down was a panicked response to the unsafe gear indication and not something that the pilots actually took some time to analyze before doing. And this action would definitely make things much worse for them, as we will soon see. By the time the gear was now lowered again, almost all of the hydraulic fluid had been lost from both the main hydraulic systems. The Boeing 727 has backup manual control cables for the elevators, ailerons and pitch trim, but these require the pilots to move them using muscle power, and that requires a lot of strength for every input. On top of that, the 727's rudder doesn't have a cable-operated backup. Instead, it's powered by both main hydraulic systems as well as a third, independent standby system that can be activated by flipping the standby rudder switch on the aft overhead panel. In the event of an engine failure, we pilots know that the first important thing to do is to use the rudder to cancel out the yawing movement caused by the asymmetric thrust. But, of course, what they were now facing was no ordinary engine failure. Since the right main gear had been removed, causing the total loss of both main hydraulic systems, this now meant that the normal redundancy for the rudder control had been completely lost. This in turn meant that the airplane now started yawing towards the failed right engine as the asymmetric thrust pushed the nose that way, and the normal counteraction of this moment using the left rudder was made impossible, unless the flight engineer would activate that standby rudder switch. If he would have done so, it would have been theoretically possible to get the plane back under control and maybe even make an emergency landing at a later point. But unfortunately, amid the chaos and panic, this never happened, and I actually don't really blame him. Like I said before, this was a scenario none of them would have ever seen before, and activating that switch would have formed part of an emergency checklist that normally would have been done after having properly identified the malfunction, something that they just didn't have time to do in this scenario. And now, since the landing gear was down, causing loads of extra drag, the airplane also started to lose its speed, and at lower speeds, control authority from the flight controls are reduced even more. The captain tried to keep the wings level by using the ailerons, but the yaw was still getting worse, and since their speed was now also dropping, he was losing aileron authority. As he fought to maintain control, the first officer applied maximum power on the remaining engines, while both pilots called for each other to fly it gently. The airplane climbed to a maximum altitude of 790 feet, at which point its speed had just dropped too much and it now started descending instead. This caused multiple terrain warnings to again blare out in the cockpit, and the captain also warned that they were on the verge of stalling. Meanwhile, the flight engineer frantically began to try to dump fuel to reduce the weight of the airplane, but it was too late for that, since to dump fuel in any meaningful amount takes a lot of time. Time that they just didn't have. The fuel jettison valves still opened up and the fuel started pouring out from the wings, but it really didn't help. As the airplane now embarked on a slow descending right-hand turn, the captain exclaimed that the plane wasn't accelerating, and he now also asked the first officer to raise the landing gear again, likely finally realizing that in their initial panic, they had made a very bad mistake in extending it. But of course, when the first officer tried to raise the gear, it wouldn't come back up, since there was now no hydraulic fluid left to lift it. It was likely at this point it became clear they were both out of time and out of options. Impact was now imminent. The pilots started engaging in panic back and forth discussions about raising or lowering the gear, even though there was nothing that they could do about it. And as that was happening, the stick shaker had now also started rattling away, confirming the captain's earlier comments about the aircraft being close to a stall. But the captain kept trying desperately to remain airborne, despite insufficient airspeed and a still worsening yaw, now just a few dozen meters above the ground. Seconds later, the speed finally became so low that it couldn't support flight with this increasing bank angle. The aircraft stalled, meaning an uncontrolled loss of lift, which caused a final steep bank over to the right and straight into the ground, within viewing distance from the airport. And the entire flight had at this point lasted only 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Now, the aircraft impacted with its nose and right wing first, causing it to immediately roll over inverted before both wings separated and the cockpit snapped off. A large explosion then consumed most of the wreckage as the fuel load completely combusted, and the severed cockpit came to a rest away from the flames, but even though that was the case, 4 out of the people on board have died instantly from the impact forces, and 1 succumbed to his injuries later at the hospital. But the mechanic actually managed to survive, and despite suffering serious injuries, he was somehow able to escape from the wreckage, where he was soon assisted by bystanders and rescuers. Colombia's Accident Investigation Group concluded that the causes of the accident were inadequate flight planning by the crew and the airline, improper decision-making by the flight crew, and the captain's improper rotation technique. The illegal use of a 727 at an unapproved airport, the airline's failure to modify the takeoff cards, the excessive weight, the lax oversight from the Civil Aviation Authority, and the crew's failure to activate the standby rudder hydraulic system were all cited as contributing factors. But while the flight crew made several serious mistakes here, it's also obvious that this accident could likely only have taken place within the dangerously lax operating culture at Aerosucre. The investigators therefore made several recommendations, mostly just suggesting that Aerosucre should comply with basic regulations and that the Civil Aviation Authority should actually enforce them, which seems like a pretty low bar to reach if you ask me. But if there is one thing that I want everyone to take away from this video, whether you're a pilot, an airline manager, or you work in some other industry where safety is important, it's this. If you start to recognize frequent omissions or little breaches of procedures, even if they don't seem all that significant at the moment, it's a sign that the holes in the Swiss cheese are now growing bigger. If that kind of culture is allowed to last long enough, then an accident becomes not only possible but almost inevitable. Margins are there to minimize the impact of unforced errors, and if they are taken away or ignored, eventually bad things will happen. Now, this video was made possible partly by the supporting members of my Patreon crew, who makes it possible for me to hire new team members and expand into even bigger and better productions. If you enjoy this content, you can join us as well using the link in the description below, which is patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.